Welcome to another of our podcasts recorded at the Rockwell Foundation, Berlin, where I am talking to some of the economists who are creating the next edition of the Handbook of Labor Economics. My name is Tim Phillips. The last few years have seen a resurgence of the power of unions in the US and Europe. One example of this was the industrial action that was taken by the Union of Auto Workers in the US at the end of 2023, which was successful in winning concessions from most of the major car manufacturers. When I spoke to Suresh Naidu of Columbia, who is one of the authors of the Handbook chapter on the impact of union membership, the reasons for the UAW's surprising victory was the first thing we discussed.
So this recent UAW strike is very interesting, partly because they won a really great contract. They won raises, they won benefits, they won keeping a plant open. And that is just extremely rare for like a union to win, not just wages and benefits, but also location of investment. And so it was a bet that the UAW made that they could win this, and they won that bet. It's a good signal to the rest of the labor movement that we're now in a period where you can strike and win, where for so long, strikes were at a very, very low level, partly because the ones that we had, unions often lost. Yeah. And so there's the famous air traffic controller strike in the 80s where Reagan fires everyone. There's other strikes like in the private sector, like Hormel and in the Midwest, where workers just get pummeled and most of the strikers wind up losing their jobs. And there's an interesting paper that shows that prior to 1982, it used to be the case that when you experienced a strike, you would often lose some money, but then you'd come back with a higher wage. But then since 1982, strikes have just been a bad thing for the workers engaged in them. There's two things. One is it's just not a great period for manufacturing, which is where strikes were traditionally concentrated, whereas sectors like steel and auto, where both globalization and automation really made it very credible for employers to say, we're not going to give you anything because we either can't because we're facing competition from much cheaper importers, or because we can choose to relocate abroad or to a right to work state. And so we don't have to give you anything. There's another important, it's not even a policy change, it's above and beyond anything that's written down in a law or in a contract. There was a norm in the post-war period in the US that even when you had a strike, what employers often do is they hire replacement workers, unfavorably known as scabs. But then when the strike was over, you would rehire the striking workers. And that was just how it was done. Starting in the 70s, that norm unravels, where basically it's now you don't rehire the striker, but you start using permanent replacements. And that's just one of a number of both legal, but also I think just part of what transformed in 1970s, rise of neoliberalism, was a sort of whole set of norms about the relationship between business and labor just kind of got rewritten. And so we got into this norm where management thought it was open season on unions, and the sort of previous regime of give and take was undone. But now I think in this post-COVID era in particular, we're in this era where the labor market is extremely tight in the sense that the unemployment rate is extremely low. Workers have an enormous amount of leverage in a way that they didn't. And we have had inflation. And so workers kind of want their wages to keep pace with inflation. And so it's been a moment where if you were going to strike and strike successfully, corporate profits are very high, but yet there's a lot of power in the labor market. You can try to grab some of that money for workers where you're organized. And I think this rash of both strikes and threats of strikes and contract renegotiations has redounded to the benefit of a lot of workers, is because we're in this new environment where employers no longer have the kind of whip hand that they had in the previous regime.
Were the rules rewritten globally, Suresh, or is the United States an outlier for having very low union membership?
The United States is an outlier in its extremely low union density. I will say, though, interestingly, that the fall in the UK union density is even steeper than the US. So it starts at a much higher level, but it falls in that period of the late 70s, early 80s, even further than the US union density falls. And union density, particularly in the Anglophone countries, Canada, Australia, the UK, the US, has generally been declining, and it's something we talk about in our handbook chapter, It's because in these Anglophone systems, the level at which a union is formed is at the level of an establishment or a bargaining unit, and you get a contract that covers one establishment, maybe a few establishments, but it's kind of this very patchworky process. And in other systems in continental Europe, you have these sectoral agreements that cover all the employers in a given sector, and it can be negotiated by the unions, but it's automatically extended to cover all the employers. So what that means is that in Europe, even new employers that are just starting out still need to pay the wage and benefits that are stipulated in the sectoral agreement. While in the Anglophone systems, new employers need to be freshly organized. And so you need to have this contentious process where workers file for a union election and win 50% plus one, and employers fight that tooth and nail and have lots and lots of resources and capacity to fight worker unionization. And so you just have to do that over and over and over again in the US and generally in the Anglophone system, but the US is particularly hostile to this. You're just constantly on this hamster wheel where just the natural churn of business means that you have exits and entry firms. And then for union density and coverage to keep up, you just need to be freshly organizing all of these new firms. And so that just means that you're always playing catch up. Given that institutional setup and just the natural dynamism of an economy, it would require an enormous expenditure of organizing resources and an enormous willingness of workers to go through this very contentious process of winning a union in order to even just keep union density and coverage constant. Well, in the European systems, the collective bargaining agreement just exists. It covers everyone. And that's true across Europe, but it varies a lot from place to place. And how good those sectoral agreements are can also vary. So you'll have some unions in Portugal that they have sectoral agreements, but they've never renegotiated them in 20 years. And so they're just very decrepit. But you do kind of have the general regime of collective bargaining institutions and collective bargaining coverage that isn't tied to union membership or a union recognition process. It can live independently of it. The classic example is France, which actually has very, very low union membership. It's 9%, but it has almost complete coverage of the private sector. Being a union member in France is closer to being a union activist. You're the person that is representing the union in the works council or on the shop floor. And it lives independently of whether or not you're actually paid the wage that's stipulated in a collective bargaining agreement. And one of the things we're doing in our handbook chapter is study much more the collective bargaining side of things and understand union membership as one dimension of how collective bargaining works. But it's only in the US that these two things really live on top of each other, where collective bargaining and union membership are one-to-one. But in most of the OECD, these are pretty decoupled. That's a power that must rule in every land. One industrial union grant.
When we study union membership or organised labour in economics, we very often thought about them agitating for higher pay. It's all about the money, and you can see why that is. That's an easy thing to measure. Is the power of a union all about getting more money?
It's not just about getting more money. So me and my collaborators, we've been embedded with a bunch of unions as they've been trying to organize new plants and kind of studying the process in some detail. And pay would help. Pay always helps. But really the thing that gets somebody to really go through this very socially costly process of you have to get your coworkers together, you have to form an organizing committee, you have to petition the NLRB, you then have 6 weeks to win an election, and it can really tear apart shop is the union drive. Often the things that make people want to undertake that process is mistreatment, bad management. Organizers will often talk about dignity on the job as something that workers are looking for. A manager mistreating workers is kind of a really common impetus for workers to start unionizing. And that can live independently of wages. And then I think in particularly in the high wage parts of the economy, so in tech or in some parts where wages are already pretty high, often what people are looking for is much more control over their work.
Yeah.
In tech, for example, some say over design decisions, some more autonomy over their schedule. So it's often these non-pecuniary dimensions of work that they care about. And a big one that's really unique to the US is health benefits, because you get your health benefits through your employer. And so US unions deliver healthcare benefits as a big part of their package. And so that's neither wages nor is it conditions of work, but it is a really important thing that unions bargain over.
If we zoom out to the macro level, can we get an idea of how effective union membership is? For example, do they have an effect on inequality, which you would imagine, if their function is to protect the rights and the benefits of the least privileged people in society?
If you look to see where union density is the highest among workers, it's roughly in the middle of the wage distribution. So it's 40th through 60th percentile of the wage distribution is where union density peaks. And that's true of union membership in the US and in Germany. Of course, union coverage in Germany is much higher and is much smoother across the income distribution. Unionized firms in both countries tend to be larger as well. And large firms already pay a higher wage. And it's true that unions raise wages the most for workers at the bottom, but it's also that's where employers fight unions the most. And so that's why you see the union coverage highest in the middle is because at the bottom, where unions would raise the wages the most is where they're not present because of the difficulties of organizing unions in those places. So the micro effects of unions on inequality are still positive. Like basically unions do compress the wage distribution and high education workers get much less of a premium when they're unionized relative to low education workers. And so they do have a net equalizing effect, but the micro effect alone, it's there, but it's small on the whole. But it's really once you account for these macro effects, and it's much harder to establish causal identification in this. It's actually one of the reasons that I sort of first got into unions was kind of studying it historically, because that's the period in which you kind of have these big increases in union density that are very sudden. And so you can really draw a fine bead on the causal effects of like a big aggregate increase in union density is like in the mid 20th century, because we haven't had that anywhere else. And yes, you're raising the wages of people in the union, but there's also these massive spillover effects onto non-union workers. And you even see it with this UAW contract. So with this UAW contract already, Toyota, on the day after it was settled, announced a big wage increase for its non-union workers. Even the non-union workers in the big three auto plants got a raise as a result of the unionized workers getting a raise. And now I think we're seeing it like Tesla workers in Germany and Sweden are now getting raises because those unions are asking Tesla, which is not unionized in the US, but faces unions in Europe for raises because now like the auto industry is on notice that the wage standard is getting pushed up. There's a variety of mechanisms, both labor market competition, just the norms and patterns of what workers expect, the threat of further unionization that all worked so that even when union density goes up and raises wages for unionized workers, it spills over and winds up raising wages for non-unionized workers as well. Once you account for that, you get much larger overall macro effects of unions on inequality. Then you can kind of see the stuff that we see historically. You can't just account for the historical effects with just the effect of unions on union members. You need to allow for there to be effects on non-union members as well.
Suresh, this is a fantastic story. It's so interesting, and it's getting more interesting all the time. So good luck with your work. Good luck keeping up with it.
Thank you. Thanks for chatting.
Thanks for listening. The Rockwell Foundation Berlin Institute for the Economy and the Future of Work is providing new knowledge to inform public debate and to create the best possible basis for policy making. Find out more at rfberlin.com.